On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was shot and killed in Dallas, Texas. That part isn't in question. Everything else about that day has been argued over for more than 60 years. And here's the strange part. This isn't some ancient mystery buried in dust with no records left to check. It's the opposite. There are millions of pages of government documents about this case. FBI files, CIA cables, Secret Service reports, congressional investigations. The problem was never a lack of paperwork. The problem was that for decades, huge portions of it were locked away, redacted, or classified secret indefinitely. That started changing in a real, legally forced way starting in 2017. And what's come out since then isn't a single smoking gun that rewrites history. It's something more interesting than that. It's a slow, messy unveiling of just how much the CIA knew, how much they didn't share, and how many uncomfortable questions they spent decades trying to keep buried, whether or not those questions actually point to a conspiracy. Let's start with why these documents exist at all, because that story matters. In 1992, after Oliver Stone's movie JFK reignited public anger about how much information was still being withheld, Congress passed something called the JFK Records Act. It ordered every federal agency holding assassination-related material to hand it over to the National Archives with a hard deadline. All of it had to be fully released by 2017 unless the president specifically certified that withholding certain documents was necessary for national security. That deadline came and went with a twist. When 2017 arrived, thousands of documents were still not released. The FBI and CIA pushed back, arguing that full release would damage national security and expose intelligence sources still relevant decades later. President Trump released tens of thousands of pages that year, but held back a significant portion after those agency objections. More documents were released in 2018, then again in 2022, and again in 2023. Each wave peeling back a little more of what had been sitting in file cabinets since the 1960s. So what actually changed? Let's go through what's actually in these documents, because a lot of online chatter about this case massively overstates what's been found, and a lot of legitimate historians also argue the released material actually understates how much the CIA was hiding and why. The single biggest revelation isn't about who pulled the trigger. It's about what the CIA knew about Lee Oswald before the assassination, and how carelessly or deliberately that information was handled. Here's what we now know for certain. In the weeks before the assassination, in late September and early October of 1963, Oswald traveled to Mexico City. While there, he visited both the Soviet embassy and the Cuban consulate, reportedly trying to get a visa to travel to Cuba and then on to the Soviet Union. The CIA had surveillance on both buildings. They had phone taps. They photographed people going in and out. The documents released over the past several years confirm the CIA was tracking Oswald's movements in Mexico City in real time. They had a phone call, allegedly involving Oswald, discussing weapons and explosives with someone at the Soviet embassy. And critically, none of this urgent, alarming information was shared with the Secret Service or properly flagged as a security threat before Kennedy's trip to Dallas just weeks later. Now, does that mean the CIA was involved in the assassination? The documents don't say that. What they do show is a genuine, well-documented intelligence failure. A man who had defected to the Soviet Union, then come back to the United States, who was actively contacting Soviet and Cuban officials about travel and possibly weapons, fell through the cracks of an intelligence system that had the information sitting right in front of it. That failure alone is a big deal, because for decades the CIA's official position downplayed how much they actually knew about Oswald before the shooting. The newly released cables and internal memos make it much harder to defend that position. There's a second thread running through these documents that historians have found just as significant, and it involves a CIA officer named George Joannides. In 1978, when the House Select Committee on Assassinations reopened the investigation, the CIA assigned Joannides to be their liaison, helping the committee get access to CIA files. What the committee didn't know at the time, because the CIA didn't tell them, was that Joannides had personally run a CIA program in the early 1960s with an anti-Castro Cuban exile group that had a documented hostile public confrontation with Oswald just months before the assassination. In other words, the CIA assigned someone with a direct, undisclosed personal connection to a key piece of the case to help decide what the official congressional investigators were allowed to see. Investigators and journalists have spent years since then trying to get Joannides' full file released. Portions have come out through the recent document waves. Large parts remain redacted, or so heavily redacted that entire pages are just black boxes. This is the part of the story that even mainstream historians, not just people who believe in a broader conspiracy, find genuinely troubling. It's not evidence that the CIA orchestrated the assassination. It's evidence that the CIA actively managed and limited what the official investigation was allowed to learn about its own prior activities, more than a decade after the fact. Let's talk about the actual shooting itself for a moment, because the documents haven't changed the core physical findings nearly as much as people assume. The Warren Commission, the original 1964 investigation, concluded that Oswald acted alone, firing 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas Book Depository. That conclusion rested heavily on what's become known as the single bullet theory, the idea that one bullet passed through both Kennedy and Texas Governor John Connally, who was riding in the same car, and was also wounded. Critics have argued for decades that the trajectory required for that to happen seems almost impossible given the men's seating positions. Defenders point to forensic reconstructions and ballistics testing that support it being physically plausible, if unusual. In 1979, a later investigation, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, actually reached a different conclusion than the Warren Commission. Based on an audio recording that seemed to capture gunshot sounds from the scene, acoustic analysts testified there was a high probability of a second shooter firing from the grassy knoll area, meaning Kennedy was likely killed as the result of a conspiracy. That finding made headlines for years. Then, in the 1980s, further scientific review of that same acoustic evidence, including analysis by the National Academy of Sciences, found serious problems with the recording's timing. The sounds researchers had identified as gunshots appear to have been recorded roughly a minute after the shooting actually happened, undermining the entire basis for that second shooter conclusion. So even the government's own conclusions on this case have shifted back and forth over the decades, not because of a single new fact, but because forensic science and audio analysis techniques kept improving and kept re-examining the same evidence. This back and forth is honestly one of the most important things to understand about this case. It's not a story with one hidden document that changes everything. It's a decades-long process of small pieces sliding in and out of place, some pointing toward a lone gunman who briefly slipped past intelligence oversight, others pointing toward unanswered questions about who knew what and when. So where does that leave us with the recent releases? Historians studying the newly available material generally agree on a few things. First, the CIA's institutional secrecy around Oswald's Mexico City activities was real, extensive, and went well beyond ordinary intelligence caution. Second, the agency's handling of the Joannides assignment during the 1970s investigation represents a documented instance of the CIA obstructing its own oversight process. Third, none of the material released so far includes a definitive, unambiguous piece of evidence proving a broader conspiracy in the assassination itself. What it does prove is that the American intelligence community's public account of its own knowledge and behavior around this event was, for decades, incomplete, and in some cases actively misleading, independent of whether Oswald acted entirely alone. There are still documents that haven't been released. As of the most recent 2023 disclosures, portions of files related to sensitive intelligence sources, methods, and ongoing foreign relations remain redacted. Some agencies argue permanently. Researchers, journalists, and members of Congress continue to push for full compliance with the original 1992 law more than 30 years after it was passed. What makes this case different from a lot of historical mysteries is that it's not really a question of missing information anymore. The information mostly exists. It's sitting in file rooms and digital archives, decades old, some of it now finally public. The real story the documents tell isn't really about who killed John F. Kennedy. It's about how a government agency manages the truth over the course of 60 years, one small release at a time, one redaction at a time, revealing just enough to keep the story alive without ever fully closing the book on it. Whether that book ever fully closes might depend less on new evidence surfacing and more on whether anyone with the authority to release the rest of it ever decides the country is finally ready to see it all at once.